Are you tired of seeing blank faces and lack of engagement when it comes to teaching poetry? I don't blame you. But we have some amazing tips and tricks to turn that around and make poetry a fun and exciting subject for you and your students. And of course, these can be done any time of year when you teach poetry, but we thought this was the perfect time to talk all about things poetry as we head into April and National Poetry Month here in the US. Now, before we dive into everything that we're going to talk about, make sure that you click subscribe where you're watching this video for more videos like this one. Okay, so tip number one going into this particular video, we want our students to enjoy poetry at a human level. So before we ask students to analyze a poem, we simply want them to read or listen to the poem and enjoy it. That's it. So if you're going to read a poem aloud in your class, imagine that the author of the poem is sitting in the room with you and your students. You really want to make them proud, right? They wrote that poem as a form of artistic expression, and they're possibly revealing their deepest identity. So how can you as the teacher honor that? How can you show them that respect? And we can do that by enjoying the poem on the human level with your students. So we don't want to jump like straight into rhyme scheme or symbolism or figurative language. We simply want to enjoy the poem. And you might want to consider, how might the poet want you to read it? You can practice your pace, your pitch, your voice, your diction. You can even have students do this. You can notice the punctuation and the line breaks. And if you're not happy with how it sounds when you read it or when your students read the poem, you can even see if you can find a recording on YouTube of an actor or even the poet themselves reading the poem. And then you can play that audio for your students in your classroom. And I love this because we really just want to let students enjoy the words and the images. There can be time for analysis and reflection later, and maybe sometimes, quite frankly, it's okay to just let them experience a poem as it is and let it linger with them. So tip number one is to simply enjoy the poem for that initial read. All right, tip number two, view poetry through a different lens. So after students have read or heard a poem one time for the sheer enjoyment of it, you might want to consider viewing the poem through a different lens. And to do this, we can change the questions that we encourage our students to ask themselves as they read poetry, as they discuss poetry. And these might be questions like the following. So what can I learn about this person from the story they tell in the poem? Do I see myself reflected in some way in this poem? What insights can I take away about the individual in this poem? What insights can I take away about the greater human experience? And so imagine you're on your second reading of a particular poem. You might ask students to pick one word, one phrase, or one line from the poem to reflect on, answering any of those questions that we just shared. So you might want to go back and take a screenshot of that too. And this can open up a whole discussion about how students may see themselves and or how others are reflected in the poem. Then tip number three is we want to make poetry more approachable for them. Writing poetry does not have to be intimidating, and it may not be as hard as our students think it is. And so to make writing poetry more approachable for students, something that you can try to do is introduce them to something called copy and change poems. I love these poems. Copy and change poems are created by taking existing poems and selectively erasing certain words and then filling in the blanks. So copying and then changing. So the poem, The Red Wheelbarrow by William Carlos Williams, is a great example. So it's a super short poem, and after reading and discussing it with your students, you can have them copy and change it. So what you would do is you would give them a fill in the blank template that just has that first part of the poem that says, so much depends upon, and then we have a blank spot for them to fill in the blank, to change that last part. So here with this poem, we can encourage our students to complete the sentence and try to reveal like a big truth about themselves. So a student might write something like, so much depends upon the point guard's hand as he guides the ball down the court. Or another example would be, so much depends upon a long ago dream nestled dormant deep inside that finally blooms. There are so many benefits of trying out copy and change poems with your students. And having a sentence stem at the beginning, like the example I just shared, makes things so much easier for them when they write because it provides a starting point and structure for them with their writing of their poetry. Gives them that framework to really build upon and helps eliminate some of that pressure of coming up with a completely original idea from scratch, which is where we get all of those blank stares and blank faces, right? And it can really help reduce anxiety and writer's block and just give them more direction as they explore ideas and emotions that they want to write about. So writing, copy, and change poetry can help simplify the writing process for your students and give them that foundation, making writing poetry much more accessible and enjoyable for our students. So make sure to tune into our channel next week. We will be sharing an interactive poetry activity that will definitely hook your students, and it has something to do with March Madness poetry. All right, I'll see you next week on the channel. Make sure that you hit subscribe where you're watching this video for more like this one.